Wisconsin residents are waiting to see if a new GOP plan to curb voting access will actually become law. Although in a twist tonight, one Republican is speaking out against it. Last week, the Wisconsin Senate passed a bill to crack down on early voting hours. It passed by one vote with all Democrats opposed. The House there is expected to send it to Governor Scott Walker, the state's Republican leader. Wisconsin is also a state where the GOP passed a controversial voter ID law, which is facing some legal challenges. One Republican lawmaker who backed that bill says he's finally had enough. State Senator Dale Schultz was the only Republican to vote with Democrats against the new restriction on early voting. And that's not all. In a new interview with the Progressive Madison radio show, he basically sounded exhausted with the fact-free anti-voting agenda taking hold of so many parts of the GOP.
I don't see how you can claim to be improving things by actually reducing hours, as illogical as that sounds. I am not willing to defend them anymore. I'm just not, and I'm embarrassed by this. I just see it as plain wrong. It is all predicated on some belief that there is massive fraud or irregularities, something my colleagues have been hot on the trail of for the last 3 years and have failed miserably at demonstrating.
Schultz is right about the facts on that failure. The Brennan Center at NYU Law School found that in one Wisconsin election in 2004, there were only 7 instances of voter fraud out of 3 million votes. Schultz is retiring this year, and that means the failure is also partly his, a failure to speak out when it might have threatened his job. Joining us now is Wisconsin resident and correspondent for The Nation, Schultz Nichols. I know that Wisconsin resident is one of the highest titles you could have.
The highest.
You know this senator. Tell us about him.
Well, Dale Schultz is a pretty remarkable guy. He's more than 30 years in the Senate and has always been a Republican, a pretty conservative Republican. He was the leader of the Senate briefly. Mm-hmm. And he's not a guy who picks fights. In fact, he comes slow to them. It's interesting. You were saying there for a moment that, he should have spoken out sooner. The truth of the matter is, I think he's like a lot of conservative Republicans, mm-hmm. right up to Judge Richard Posner, mm-hmm. Who recently wrote a book. He was the judge, the U.S. Federal Court of Appeals judge, who wrote one of the key rulings on voter ID. Last year, he put a book out, and he said, boy, increasingly, it's starting to look like these laws are more about suppression than about dealing with fraud.
You mentioned that. Let me read, because we pulled that, and it's very much relevant. Judge Posner said that even though he'd ruled for basically upholding the constitutionality of voter ID in an Indiana case, he then wrote, it's now clear some photo ID requirements are more of a, quote, means of voter suppression rather than of fraud prevention, a conservative Reagan appointee, as you mentioned, John. And he basically was led here by what he considered the overwhelming evidence of a lack of any voter fraud.
Well, and I think that's what's happening with Dale Schultz. And for Schultz, it's a fascinating thing. I think it's important to understand there's a legislator like this in just about every state. An old school Main Street Republican who's stuck with the party through a lot of changes. And increasingly, you find them bristling at these sessions like what just happened in Wisconsin, where week after week they were in there passing draconian laws, and people were literally standing up saying, this doesn't make any sense, and just being rolled right over. Schultz, I think you've seen him on a number of issues start to say this just doesn't make sense. And remember, he represents a rural constituency. One of the things that they tried to do on this, the early voting change that they did to collapse the number of hours that were available, was to try and pit rural versus urban.
Right.
And I think that Schultz especially found that very discomforting, because the fact of the matter is, if you know rural folks, there's a lot of rural folks who get up before dawn to work on a farm and are out there late at night. They can use a little early voting and a little extra time as well.
And the crackdown on early voting, it's reminiscent of what we've seen in places like North Carolina. Do you think it's worse than the voter ID rules?
I think it can be. Look, here's the thing. On voter ID, usually well in advance, and you can start to organize around it. When you collapse the early voting laws, effectively what you're doing is saying to somebody who's got to get their kids off to school in the morning, work all day, maybe into the evening, that you can't vote on the weekend. Well, That's really taking away a lot of opportunity. And one thing that's very important here is there are communities that have had traditions of organizing for voting on the weekend,
Sure,
including
souls to the
African
polls,
Americans.
yeah.
Yes. And so there's an awfully lot of people who see this as a targeted assault on particular communities.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Appreciate the Wisconsin wisdom, as always. John Nichols of The Nation, thank you very much.